Welcome back to another episode of the Think Editorial podcast. I'm your host, Flavia Barbat, global communications consultant and editor-in-chief of Branding Mag. And today I have with me Harry Ashbridge. Welcome, Harry, and thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, Harry is a fellow lover of the written word and someone that has really made a name for himself implementing the public-facing writing guidelines for Monzo Bank. If you haven't seen them before, then I definitely recommend you check them out. And he's also known for combining writing with customer experience into the same room and into the same role in an effort, I think, to better depict to brand leaders the importance of writing and, of course, writing well across an organization. So I feel you can already understand why I've invited him here and given his dream of becoming the first chief writing officer ever to exist. Is that right, Harry?
As far as I know, there hasn't been one before, but I might be trying to follow in someone's illustrious list.
So we're bound to have a great discussion for sure. I have no doubt. So I think I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to begin with a question that I believe will get everyone on the same page, which is, what is the difference between things like writing, copywriting, UX design, content design? Is there a difference? Because I feel like we hear so many different terms being used for what may be a similar concept.
Yeah, I mean, some of those roles definitely tend to pay differently. There is that. I think the fact that there are so many different definitions and so many different descriptions of those roles, it kind of tells you a story. They're not very clearly separately articulated and defined. And I believe that's just because they're all flavors of the same thing, really, which is fundamentally writing. Some people are definitely more naturally inclined to pithy phrases and they end up doing more brand marketing, copywriting type work. Some people are more drawn to systems thinking and clarity, and they found their niche in UX or content design. But for me, writing is writing. All writing shares a bunch of fundamental things. You know, you have an audience, you have a purpose, something you want to convey, and then you have a list of constraints, a set of tools that you're using, a bunch of context around the thing you're communicating. And that's true of any writing for any audience at any time in any medium. And I think a really good writer should be able to flex their approach so that some people are definitely better at headlines and some people are better at microcopy, but the idea that it's a totally distinct skill set is, for me, just nonsense, really. Having said that, the rise of content design has meant that a lot more writers are now employed, especially in tech companies, and that is great. But to get those jobs, those writers have had to adopt the language of product design to get a seat at the table. And I think in that process, they've become too divorced from their brand and marketing, copywriting pals, and vice versa. And the problem with that, what I believe is an artificial separation, is that it contributes to a real siloed separation of how writing happens within a business. You know, content design often has almost nothing to do with brand copywriting. Those teams don't really spend much time together in a lot of companies. And that leads to an inconsistent approach, an inconsistent experience for customers. You have writing that's written to different principles, it's reviewed in different forums in different ways by different teams with different priorities. But from a customer's point of view, there is no separation between marketing writing or in-app writing or operational comms or T's and C's. There's just what it's like to deal with this brand. And that experience is often broken in some ways, at least partly because the writers across the business just aren't joined up very well. And it's not entirely their fault, obviously, but that split does contribute to the problem.
Is it the problem that the siloing is happening that is the issue, or does it make sense to have these different categories, let's say, but there's something overarching that kind of manages or overlooks everything that is actually the piece that's missing?
Yeah, I think partly the siloing is an outcome of people's attitudes towards writing and how different bits of writing have different purposes and people don't think of them as joined up, and also an underestimation of how important writing is and how much it is directly tied to what your brand and customer experience is. Ultimately, I think that writing is a function within a business in the way that design is or operations is, and it should be kind of unified under a single area of leadership. And I think that should be ultimately a chief writing officer is the direction I think we should be going in. We're at a place now where no one really argues that the idea of product design is important. We're seeing chief design officers, and I think that writing is just on that same journey, but a fair bit further behind on the evolution.
Do you see this single role, because you mentioned customer experience, so maybe it would make sense. How do you describe the connection between writing and brand? Is it through customer experience that you kind of depict this concept to brand leaders that maybe don't fully understand the importance of writing?
Yeah, for me, I mean, your writing is your brand, which is your customer experience. For me, those are interchangeable terms. Ultimately, they boil down to the same thing, which is what is it like to deal with this company is your brand, and that is your customer experience. They're just terms that get separated by company org charts more than anything else. In both cases, though, especially true if you're a digital service company that lives mostly on an app screen or a laptop screen. So I used to work at Monzo. It's obviously a digital bank, but this is true of any finance, insurance, energy, telecoms, anything like that. The words you're producing are the experience of the brand. They are the customer experience. The emails, the web pages, the letters, contracts, T's and C's, help articles, the in-app journey, the ads, what scripts your customer service team rely on. All of that is words, and words are the main thing that most companies produce, and they are the main way that most customers interact with you, and the main way that your teams, your colleagues interact with each other as well, especially if they're located in different places. So words are the customer experience. Words are the brand. I don't look at them as separate things at all.
I'm wondering why this isn't more clear, really, because I agree with you on the association between writing, customer experience, brand. I think both of us still find it a little bit fascinating that the association isn't so clear. And I'm wondering, what are some of the elements? What are some of the things that are frequently happening in companies that you feel must change in order for this to be more clear? Like, why isn't it that way? Is it the brand teams that should be more involved? Is it I'm trying to understand a little bit where some of the gaps are.
Yeah. I think there's a few things going on. One of them is probably that just because writing is so ubiquitous that we almost don't notice it. We all now read and write more than any humans ever have done before. Quite often I think people think, because of social media and TikTok and video first stuff, that we're all reading less. But actually, because of social media and because of Teams and Slack and WhatsApp and everything else, we are now the most literate humans that have ever lived, and we all read more words every day than any humans ever have done before. So we almost can't see the wood for the trees, really. Their words are so everywhere all the time, we're a bit blind to their impact. And so even though if you work on a laptop every day, whatever your job title says, congratulations, you are a writer. That is the main thing you do. Writing is not a skill that most people have ever stopped and thought about how to develop or strengthen. Most people have not really ever had any training on it beyond what they get in school. People don't think critically about how they write or how effective it is or why they have the habits that they do. And we've all picked up habits and prejudices and preconceptions about writing that we often aren't even aware of. And also, I think people really underestimate how much of an impact writing has. People still have this idea that font and logo and color palette are your brand. And, those things are important to get right and keep consistent to have a coherent identity. But I'm sorry, they're just not even in the same league as words when it comes to what the experience of your brand is. And companies aren't recognizing what I said earlier, that the experience is the words. And then you touched on something there about company structure, and I do think that doesn't really help. Businesses will talk about customer centricity, but the reality is that on the inside, different teams have different goals, which don't always line up with each other. What they're incentivized to do is not always necessarily what's best for the customer. And I don't mean that in terms of like, if we made this product free, it would be better for customers. I just mean in terms of creating a coherent experience that flows well from end to end is difficult because teams are siloed and don't always work towards the same goals at the same speed with the same incentives. So, for example, thinking about brand teams, I think they spend a disproportionate amount of their energy on broadcast messages. So if a brand wants to be seen as trustworthy, quite often what they'll do is do some market research, get a baseline level of how trusted their brand is, and then they'll do a series of ads aimed at measuring the increase in that metric. Whereas I think that what is or isn't making people feel like they can trust the brand probably has something to do with how the brand writes. Whether it keeps its promises from what the marketing says to what the experience delivers, whether the language it uses is consistent, or whether there's a huge difference between the nice, warm, welcoming marketing language and then the cold, officious, formal complaints process, or, God forbid, how they're going to treat you if you go behind on a repayment. And so if brand teams spent more time actually interrogating the experience of the brand from the inside, rather than trying to send messages outside, I think they would be better off. And a key way to do that is to interrogate the words that customers see through the customer journey, not just the words that are trying to sell something or attract new customers. And customer experience teams, I've been part of brand teams and customer experience teams, so I've seen both sides. I don't think they're entirely divorced from this problem as well. They have a similar issue, which is quite often customer experience team is focused on trying to define like a single magic metric that measures the experience and sits neatly on a dashboard that you can share with the exec team. It was NPS, and then we decided NPS was rubbish, and then it's customer effort score. Oh no, that doesn't work. Or it's because there isn't a single metric that will work. And again, if those customer experience teams spent more time trying to pinpoint where the experience wasn't working as well as it should, and especially where the writing that customers see just isn't effective because there's lots of it, I think they would be better off. And in all these cases, when you start to examine the writing in a process, what you're really doing is examining the process itself. Why do we do things this way? Is this effective? Does this make sense? Are we fulfilling the promises we set out earlier on? Do we even sound like the same company here as we did, on the landing page of the website? And when you're examining things through that lens, you found ways to improve the language the customers see and the processes and ways of working that underpin your communications. And that overarching view of end-to-end processes all the way through the customer journey, the only thing that exists at any point of the customer journey is words. And so that holistic view of it is something that's usually missing. And that's kind of more than anything else what I've spent what I guess I have to call a career trying to fill.
It's interesting because I completely agree with you. I think my experience has been a little bit different, let's say. So it's very interesting to hear you explain it, because for me, when I've talked about writing, well, first of all, the assumption is that we do all the writing, which there I have a little bit of there I hesitate, because I really want people to learn to write better themselves. So I don't want to be the one that, it's assumed that you can kind of just throw something my way and I do the writing. But that's obviously because I deal a lot with the thought leadership side, with the article side, with things like this, where let's say you really want people to kind of write on their own. But I've always felt like when I say writing, it becomes something smaller than it should be. And I had the opposite experience, that when I say something like editorial, people understand, okay, this is representative of the brand. But here, I think it's probably some kind of mix of the two, because here you're showing where the very, smaller components, the smaller sentences or phrases, or all the way down to that level of detail, contribute to the same perception of the brand. And so I think this is an interesting, it's an interesting concept where our two worlds meet.
Yeah, it's the classic question of like, within an area, within an industry, you get real nuanced definitions that people argue about, like what is editorial, what is content, content design or UX design. Are they the same? Are they different? Like we touched on earlier. So the association with editorial is, like you say, more long form content. And that is a part of, but I would say a small part of this wider picture of what I'm talking about. And the reason that, I call myself the head of writing and have had writing teams and will continue to have writing teams is because I think the only thing that unifies all of these different areas across brand marketing, messaging and ads and T's and C's and in-app content and editorial content is that it's all writing. Like that is ultimately what it is. And I take your point totally that some people can just look at it and go, oh yeah, but writing, like that diminishes it somehow. But I think what we should do then is try and help people see that no, actually writing is the one thing is everywhere all the time, and kind of build it up, rather than kind of do what I think content design teams have ended up doing, which is go, okay, we'll call it something else. Just let us in. Just let us in. I'd rather stand up for writing and make it bigger and be that kind of standard bearer for it, because ultimately it is writing. That is what it is. And whether I'm doing it, my team's doing it, or, we're empowering other people to do it, which is definitely what I think ultimately the role of like a chief writing officer would be, is empowering people to do good writing and to make good writing happen. Ultimately, I would still stick with that term above all else.
Do you believe that this role should also be the one responsible for managing customer experience, given what you said earlier? Because I'm sitting here thinking, how does this relate to everyone's obsession with customer 360 programs and initiatives and things like that? Are we talking about a role that combines the two, similar to some of the ones that you've, I think, had before?
Yeah, I think it depends what you mean by that, really. Like my role at Monzo and the role that I'm going to have next, it was head of writing and customer experience. It's the same deal. And writing comes first in that. Like I looked after and will look after writing overall. So that is writing on the brand side, on the marketing side, and the operational side, what you would call content design. And that looks into the user experience, obviously, because all of those things are connected in that way. It's customer experience through the lens of the words that customers are exposed to. And I also care, about how the company communicates to itself, because that affects how you end up communicating with customers. But customer experience, like brand, is one of those big, beautiful, nebulous terms, and it's so broad that really it is collectively everyone's responsibility. Although I know that when you make something everyone's responsibility, you kind of make it no one's responsibility. So what I think of as my responsibility as the head of in this scenario is to create an environment where the culture and the processes and the incentives help people to think in a customer-centric way, help everyone care about writing, everyone knows how to do it well, rather than trying to kind of take ownership and do it all in that one centralized team. Because if you do that, then people start to kind of just pass it over to you and don't take responsibility for it themselves. I'm trying to help everyone understand that no matter what their role is, they are writing. And so here is a way to be better at writing and how that will contribute to your goals and the company's goals. And you substitute the word writing for customer experience in there because it's the same idea. Everyone is partly responsible for the customer experience. Here is how to be better at contributing to that. And here is how that will help the company's goals.
And so do you envision the team of writers? Is this a team of writers that kind of sits somewhere all together, or are these writers kind of sparsed out throughout the organization?
Yeah, I think there is no perfect structure for this. There are pros and cons to any way of organizing a team structure. But what I did at Monzo and what I will probably advocate for until I figure out that no, it's wrong and try something better, is to have a team of writers who are a team of writers, but then federate them out around the business. So the writing team at Monzo, we had representatives from the writing team out in the business banking area, or working on our kind of packaged accounts, or one in borrowing, or one in operations. And their responsibility there was to be in those cross-functional teams alongside design and product and marketing and all the rest of it. And because they were in those teams, they would help shape the strategy. They would help contribute to good processes around writing. They would do lots of writing themselves, but they wouldn't write every word as a bottleneck because it's totally unscalable. They would create an environment where good writing happened in that area through writing, reviewing, coaching, creating guidance, standardizing templates and stuff like that, or just being there to be the standard bearer for what good writing looks like. And then our team of writers would come together and spend a bunch of our time together as well to make sure what we were doing lined up and was coherent across the business.
I love that. Does that mean that an agency model doesn't really work? I mean, to outsource it doesn't really work if you need, because, a lot of people are outsourcing writing, and now we're also going to probably touch on at some point outsourcing to AI, but that's a whole nother story. But just outsourcing to people in general. Do you feel like it has to be internal in order for it to really have the best effect? Because you're not just talking about, I'm going to write this piece of content and then we're done. Yeah. You're talking about an entire experience in and of itself that ultimately contributes to the success of the brand long term in terms of its employees, in terms of its culture, etc. So that can't be outsourced.
I worked in an agency for 6 years before I went to Monzo, so I'm not talking to someone who's never been on the other side of the fence. But you absolutely should not and cannot outsource all of your writing to an agency and expect to have good, coherent, like end-to-end experiences. Because how can the agency ever really know you or get close enough to how you work unless they're fully embedded day to day? And if they're fully embedded day to day, but you're paying a retainer for that, it's going to be cheaper to hire people internally. And I know that companies go on the cycle of, we haven't got any new creative ideas, we need to get an agency, and then they get an agency, and then in 18 months time they go, God, this is expensive, and then let's in-house it, and then they in-house it, and then 18 months later they go, we need fresh ideas, let's get an agent. There's just a cycle that's gone on for quite a while. And AI, we'll talk about AI later on, maybe that will change things a bit. But I think what people find when they get too reliant on agencies is ultimately that the work just gets kind of separated from the rest of the business. How could you have a writing agency hired by a brand team that was really embedded in what was going on in operations and design? Like, that's where you need the kind of federated team. And part of the reason, I worked in an agency for a while, part of the reason I went in-house at Monzo is because I was sick of getting briefs which kind of described a presenting problem that the company had, but didn't let us get in to tackle anything of the actual underlying causes of that problem. Then you get loads of agencies, and the more time that your brand team spends managing agencies, the more they essentially just become brand managers. Brand managers are often just really their agency managers. And again, that's time that we would have spent trying to improve what the experience of the brand is on the inside. And then lastly, agencies are inclined to say yes when they should say no. You are paying them good agencies will check and challenge you, but ultimately it's your dollar or euro or pound or whatever it is. And the agency mostly cares about staying on retainer more than they care about kind of really pushing for what the right thing is. And that is just not the recipe for really strong first principles. Is this the best approach thinking? Because quite often the right thing would be for an agency to say, you know what, you should get rid of us. And obviously they're never going to do that.
I think that's a little bit of the issue that I have with AI as well is ironically very parallel in the sense that it doesn't have the concept of the consequences of its actions, so to speak. So it just delivers. And this is why, when we have conversations about AI and people, will often ask, why don't you feel threatened by it? Or, should I feel threatened by it? Or you just described a behavior that was similar to what AI is doing before AI actually came into the picture. So I think this is the thing is like, what are the behaviors that people had that are being shown and kind of blown up a bit by AI? Because those are the things that you want to avoid. It's not about the technology at the end of the day. It's about what is this evolution, so to speak, or this next step telling us about ourselves. And I like that you pointed to something with the agency model that I think is a little bit of that human behavior that maybe wasn't right. And you have so much experience. I feel based on our conversations that we've had, you've had so much experience taking these hard conversations, and carrying the torch for the hard conversations and saying, no, this is not the right way. There's a better way. I know that it takes a bit more time, or I know that maybe we need, that it looks different, but you have a way of explaining to brand leaders that this role is essential, that an organized approach to solid writing is really an absolute requirement. How do you convince them of that? Are there red flags that show the negative effects of poor writing that you turn to, or how do you get them to do what you say, even though it's difficult, let's say, or it's different?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've partly been lucky in that the culture of the places where I've worked has been open-minded, prepared to challenge processes, to really think customer first. I think you need to convince people beyond brand, like brand leaders in the sense of people in the brand marketing world, yes. But brand leaders includes product leaders and the people in risk and compliance, because how quickly your brand can move is partly a risk appetite question. And you've got operational leaders, because operational comms is often the bit that's communicating most often with customers and that brand doesn't really get involved in very much. So it's the leaders of the business really that you have to get lined up, because writing to customers is an outcome of interconnected people and processes and systems across all the business, including a lot of people who don't actually write to customers or think of themselves as writers. When I pitched my job at Monzo, because they weren't hiring, I kind of forced my way in. I wrote them an email saying, I can see that you care about writing. It's obvious in your app and your website and how clear your kind of T's and C's are, but you are small now and it's not going to scale on its own. And I can try and give it some structure and create processes and try and create this legacy of a culture where people understand the value of writing, care about it, and can do it really well day to day. And because Monzo cares about doing the right thing and understood that if you want to disrupt finance, you have to change how finance communicates, they hired me. But that is the start of the process of convincing people. I had a blank slate, but then everyone was just kind of like looking at me going, go on, what are you going to do? The way to get people on board once you've got your toe in the door is to help them understand that every bit of writing that a company does has a purpose for the business. And so if the writing isn't effective, you are damaging the business. It hurts the bottom line, it hurts customer trust, it hurts loyalty, it hurts efficiency. If you look at the correlation between brand marketing spend and customer satisfaction, there is not one, because I think companies are probably spending too much money on the wrong words. And if you have a quick look into the messaging in a business that's going out on typically considered serious topics like debt collections or complaints or claims or the less sexy operational parts of the business, you're almost always going to find writing that is a long way from whatever the brand says it stands for in its brand house or brand onion or brand lettuce or whatever it is. It's cold, confusing, full of jargon, quite possibly aggressive, and that is not effective. And so you have to help people understand that how a company communicates is part of its values in action. And if you say you're customer-centric, but your T's and C's are totally incomprehensible, then you are just not. You're objectively not customer-centric. That doesn't really get people that motivated on its own, because the idea of customer centricity and the idea of brand value is kind of abstract. So rather than going in and talking about brand and tone of voice, I just started to go around the business and say, look, what problems do you have? And then try to figure out how writing could help solve those problems. So, engineers are trying to write proposals that, clearly explain what they want to build. And they're writing commit messages in GitHub for the changes they're making to the code. And that is a writing challenge. Product managers are trying to get alignment, and they're trying to sell ideas to senior stakeholders, and that is a writing challenge. The borrowing team is trying to help people stay on track with repayments, or to help people quickly get out of debt. And because that's written communication, that is a writing challenge. And everyone is writing every day. And if you can help them see that being more effective at writing directly means that they are better at their job, you open their mind to thinking about writing in a way that talking about brand or tone of voice. You'll notice I haven't used the term tone of voice once at all up until now, because I just think it sets people up to think that this is a fluffy marketing thing that doesn't really mean anything or achieve anything. But writing is a thing that happens every day, and it directly contributes to metrics that you can measure. And that opens people's minds in a way that brand values just doesn't. And then from there, you have your foot in the door, and you can influence process. You can ask to be more directly involved in the work, make more fundamental change, because people are already brought into how this helps them, and you've already demonstrated your value to them and their part of the business.
I love the idea of asking people what their challenges are, talking to them, helping them see that writing is a direct contributor to that. I love the fact that it goes around some of the terminology that I am a big fan of the terminology as well, but because I know what it means. So I realize that that's not true for everyone. So I like the simplicity. I like the clarity of it. I like the approach. I'm wondering where verbal fits in, because we talk a lot about written communication, but how does this process, like where in your process or the way you think about, let's say, that role or that structure in the organization, where does it relate back to also what people say? Because that's also a huge part of the customer experience, not just what they write, but what they say with words, with voice.
Yeah. I mean, if you have obviously frontline call centers and that kind of stuff where you're talking, or you have branches or shops where people come in and talk to you, it's, for a while, I feel like the trend was to have that stuff really heavily scripted. And then people realized that you can't script a scenario for every possible human interaction, because people are not rational and don't do what you think you'll do. So you end up with kind of notes or training of the kind of things to say, or the kind of topics you should or shouldn't talk about, and phrases you can or can't use. That stuff already originally somewhere is written down. Like, you train your call handlers with a written script, like who writes the script and what does that say? So it still does come back to writing, because if you haven't written it down somewhere, you haven't recorded it anywhere, and how can anyone come along and use it in the future? It's not scalable to have everything, sat around the campfire going mouth to ear like it was in the good old days. And then the way that it relates to verbal is that, the classic bit of good writing advice is to write more like you speak. And that doesn't mean make it sound like dialogue, but a real test for how readable and straightforward and easy to understand a bit of writing is does it sound like the kind of thing you'd actually say? Because ultimately we are better and more efficient at talking than we are at writing, because we've been talking for a million years and we've been writing for about 5 minutes. And with writing, we have all these hang-ups about what professionalism is, and what we learned at school, and who we're trying to impress in the exec team who, is going to maybe read this writing in the future. And so we just get in our own way with business writing in a way that we don't when we talk. So the principles are ultimately the same. You're looking for clarity and straightforwardness and what the reader is interested in, and empathy for them. And empathy for them doesn't necessarily mean being nice. It means giving them what they need, which sometimes is just bad news really clearly and straightforwardly. So I don't think there's really too much of a separation in it. I think just with spoken training, what I would and have tried to avoid is leaning too much into being really scripted, because I just think it ends up being too artificial.
And you mentioned artificial, which is interesting because I was just thinking about something related to, let's say, the opposite of that, that I wanted to ask you your opinion on, because many of the, let's say, communications people of all types that I've spoken to that are obviously very interested in writing, very interested in comms, very interested in editorial as well, etc. They feel this pressure to create or to write or to speak in a way that feels maybe a little too minimally refined for what they would prefer, or what they would tend towards. Do you think there's space for that, though? Do you think there's space for this kind of writing that we see online that I think a lot of brands feel like they need to try to adopt, where it's less put together, there are no capital letters, there's less punctuation, less care for grammar, less, all for the sake of feeling a bit more raw in an effort to feel a bit more human, to feel a bit more authentic, where when, there's an entire group of us, for example, where that is the complete opposite of how we naturally are, for example, or I don't know. I feel sometimes I look at these kinds of examples online and I feel like we've really surpassed like a limit of propriety that I just I can't fully comprehend. So I ask the opinions of others like yourself that I respect, say, is there space for this? Am I the crazy one, that is just like too strict or too, I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So there's like language has always evolved, will always continue to evolve. I remember reading, I can't remember what book it was. I wish I could say so we can call out the author and give them their flowers. But basically, they'd found like a stone tablet in ancient Sumeria where some teacher had written a review of their class saying, "Oh, they've totally lost grip with grammar. Everything's going to the dogs. Writing standards are going down the toilet." And that was like 4000 BC. Like every generation looks at the one coming and goes, "Oh my God, we've totally lost control." And I think there's a little element of like cultural conservatism in it, and also just a little fear of change with a little bit of dose of our own mortality chucked in there. Like it tends to be more about that than anything else. The pace of change has definitely accelerated because of the internet, and the speed of dissemination of ideas is obviously quicker than it's ever been before. And like the internet has grown its own language and ways of talking, and the idea that if you use a full stop in a text, it's rude, it's kind of aggressive. If you use a capital letter, it's somehow really formal. All that kind of like those rules have come and gone and changed and evolved. And I am absolutely not the right person to speak with any authority about like what the generation coming after mine will think of as appropriate or inappropriate. When it comes to grammar, I am a descriptivist rather than a prescriptivist. And the prescriptivist is someone who says there is correct grammar, and if you deviate from it, you're wrong. And a descriptivist is someone who says, if you're talking in your own language and someone in your own language can understand you, then you're not wrong. And those are like the extreme ends of the scale, but I'm definitely more on the descriptivist end. And so as long as your message is clear and your writing achieves the aim it's intended to achieve in line with, the specific purpose of that one communication, but also what you want to stand for as a brand. And if you can consistently use that same approach in all of your writing, then do whatever you want, basically, as long as it works for you. My question with those brands that really chuckle with the conventions out of the window and have really esoteric or niche little linguistic flourishes is, okay, and what about in your T's and C's? Are you doing it there? Because if you're not, well, then you don't have one brand. You have two or three, or, and then you have that broken experience I was talking about earlier. So like with Monzo, for example, we were really well known for the quality of our writing, which I'm very proud of. For me, we did not have a distinctive tone of voice. If you go and look at the Monzo tone of voice guidelines, thank you for calling them out earlier. I'm still very proud of them. They're just kind of like Good Writing 101 with a little bit stuck in about humor and what kind of conversations we could get in or not get involved in. But we only added that in literally about a year ago. For the first 5 years I was there, it was just good, clear, straightforward writing. What made us different and what stood out and what people responded to more than anything else, I think, was that we consistently applied that everywhere. You could go to the front page of the website or the back page of the T's and C's or talk to us in customer service, and it would feel like we were one company, one set of people with the same goals and the same values. We dialed up our personality on social channels because that is the realm of social, but I don't think that is what 12 million people signed up to Monzo for. I don't think most of them are even on Twitter if you were going to, be really strict about it. So the consistency of what you do is more important than the distinctiveness. And so if you're adopting a bunch of really niche or quirky tonal points and you can only apply them in 20% of your writing, well, that is not your tone of voice. The other 80% is your tone of voice. And for most companies, it is officious and cold and full of jargon. And I'd be more interested in tackling that. And that will definitely, I would say, have a bigger impact on how people feel about your brand than trying to chase whatever Gen Z kind of linguistic phase is going through, which is foolish anyway, because it will be gone in 3 years and there'll be something in its place.
I love that. But there are rules of good writing then. I mean, because this is what I find interesting is that the thing that made Monzo distinctive was that it followed, let's say, quote unquote, the rules of good writing, while nobody else was really doing that consistently across the board. So then where does the versatility come in? I mean, if everybody starts to just have good writing and clear writing, then we are all going to sound, I mean, it's probably going to take a while. So the ones of us that are here right now doing it are in a good position. After a while, does everybody start to sound the same? No, because you have things like humor, you have other things that you can bring in that are a bit more of the personality. So maybe it's not tone of voice, but you definitely believe in brand personality coming in and kind of changing the language, the verbiage, and things like this. If this foundational level doesn't exist across the board, then there's just no point in building something on top of that.
Exactly. Yeah. Raise the floor before you worry about trying to raise the ceiling. And right now, I don't think there is a single company in the world that consistently writes really well at all times. And I include Monzo in that, even, when I was there. I think we did definitely the best of any finance company, but that's a relatively low bar to leap because it's really hard. You have thousands of people writing every day to customers with different reasons behind it and different review forums and different ideas of what good looks like and different levels of experience and confidence. So it's really hard to get that consistency. But you're right. Like if we did end up at a point where everybody was writing pretty well and clearly, and it is, it's definitely better than it was 10 years ago, which is better than it was 20 years ago. Like companies do understand this stuff. And that's the benefit of having more content design teams working on the operational side of the business alongside the brand marketing stuff. Then the differentiation point does become personality and also what I would call, and again, this is where our terminology might differ, what I would call like your editorial position. Like what topics do you talk about? What conversations do you get involved in? What's your point of view? So rather than just, how you're saying the thing, what are you actually saying? I think companies can definitely make a difference for themselves in that place. Like I think about an example like Ben and Jerry's. Ben and Jerry's have a really strong social conscience and they will talk about things that, I'm just going to name a brand off the top of my head, Microsoft won't. And I think that's partly their tone, but it's more about what do they stand for? And it goes back to that point that your writing is evidence of your values in action. So what do you really stand for as a brand? Okay, well then what does that mean for how you should communicate? There's a bar you have to meet of clarity and straightforwardness for your audience. And then beyond that, what makes you you? Now, it might be humor. It might be a real straightforwardness. It might be that you'll talk about this topic that no one else is willing to talk about. But I think you have to reach that bar first. And most companies fall woefully short of it, even while at the same time they're trying to grasp some linguistic difference that they only get to apply or even try to apply in like 20% of what they write anyway.
Incredible. And you touched on values and on culture. And I feel, I have a sense that is a huge component of how you actually build this kind of cohesive environment once you've, let's say, been given the task to do so, which you have in several cases. And hopefully those listening will also have the same chance if they're interested in doing so. But culture is a big piece of that. Is that the first step, let's say, when it comes to building this? We said that we're looking forward to the moment where more organizations have this kind of approach built in, but how do we go about actually?
You have to have a customer-centric approach and open-mindedness to get good writing at all times, because good writing is a result of good processes and good, I'm going to use the word good as if it's a universal thing, like good processes, good understanding of what people want, an easy, straightforward way for good ideas to percolate and come to the surface. A lot of companies, there's like a 9-step approval process for changing any bit of comms, and it goes around the houses and it goes on SharePoint and it goes off SharePoint and it goes in someone's inbox and then back to a forum and then off to another forum. And almost none of those people in that process think of themselves as being involved in creating a customer experience or contributing to the brand, because they might be in second line risk and compliance, or they might be engineers who just want to code the damn thing, or and so you need, first of all, everyone to think that they are part of this coherent whole that is creating an experience, and that the experience should be, above all else, good for the end user, good for the customer. And the way you get people to buy in and care about that language is what I spoke about earlier, when you go to them and say, look, what problems do you have? Here is how better writing can help you. And oh, by the way, when you're doing that, you're also contributing to the customer experience. You embed it in a few ways. You can embed it through training, you can embed it through guidance, you can embed it through role modeling it from the senior leadership team, talking about it loudly, tying it back to how the values of the business are related to good communication. And those are all elements that you have to put in place once that kind of core understanding of, okay, writing is important, we get it, now what? Once you've got the now what, then you can go into the more practical side.
What has your experience been like with the training? Do you have a certain approach or a certain style or something that you've seen work really well to get people, to really think, especially at a point in time like now where they feel like they can outsource the writing literally to a robot? How do you get them interested in actually improving the way they write and training them to do so?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest impact thing that I do and have done is definitely training. You're trying to give people the permission, first of all, to change their approach if they've written a certain way for a long time, and then the confidence that it's the right thing to do and that they can do it, and then practical skills to actually apply it. And that's especially important for the people, like I said, who don't think of themselves as writers traditionally, but are really involved in how writing actually works: legal, risk, compliance, engineering. And Monzo, I made it so that writing training was a mandatory part of everyone's onboarding. And that kind of puts it on par culturally with things like anti-money laundering training. And it says to the new joiners, this is how we do things in a sort of a non-negotiable way. And in that training, you are helping people see, writing is part of what you do every day. And then here is the science behind what makes writing effective. Here are the universal principles that you can apply to any audience for any bit of writing that then are going to make you have a better chance of that writing be effective. And here's practical skills on how to do it. But that always comes with an element of therapy, because everybody learns to write when they're small and vulnerable. And we all have kind of hang-ups from a teacher who was a bit aggressive wielding the big red pen, or we have prejudices or bad habits that we learned at school about, we all have to write to a word minimum at school for essays. And then that teaches you implicitly that the more words you've written, the more work you've done. And then we carry that into work and we write a 50-page report, and then no one reads it because who the hell is going to read 50 pages? And then we go, oh no. So we're all having to unlearn as much as learn in any writing training process, because being more effective often means kind of getting out of habits that you might have had over a really long career. And also criticism of writing can feel like criticism of you personally, because writing and words are so fundamental to our sense of self. And so you have to make room in any training session for people to have a strong reaction. People need to vent, they need to be heard, they need space to disagree and then be won around by the evidence and the science. So as a trainer, you have to have quite a light touch, but also be ready with facts and figures and examples. And after a while, you kind of get a feel for when someone has something they want to say, but they just sat there not saying it. And so you make room so that they can get it off their chest. And that's how to ride the emotional element of a training session is a muscle that you develop over time. And I've been doing that for quite a long time now. I must be in the high hundreds, nearly 1,000 training sessions over the years.
That's incredible. I love that. What comes after the training? How do you maintain the right application, the importance of your editorial guidelines and that training, over time? What have you seen be very effective?
Yeah. So you do need guidelines that say this is how we write. You need it agreed as a central source of truth, and you need to get that settled before you then start trying to apply it everywhere. But no one really reads big, hefty sets of guidelines. And one tome that tries to be everything to all people is often quite useless. They usually sit in a drawer and never get used. At Monzo, we put ours online because one of our company values was default to transparency. So you ask yourself, is there a reason not to make this open? And there was no reason not to make it open. So we put it on the internet, and then we got a lot of kind of attention and praise for it. And we could hold ourselves to that public standard. And that was quite useful for me and the team in the early days when we were kind of needing to point back to it and say, look, this is public. People see it. Are we living up to it or not? But I think what is more effective kind of day to day is to give people guidance at the point of use. So if you're a product designer working in Figma, for example, I want there to be some components that are pre-designed for you. You shouldn't have to decide if the button says continue or next. It should be, and why are people having to reinvent that every time? Or why should a writer have to come along after a designer and edit something to make it say next instead of continue? We should just have that agreed. And then I want tooltips that pop up and give you advice on what our writing principles are as you go. And similarly, when you open a template in Word or PowerPoint or Google Docs or whatever it is, there should be guidance there, and how to use structure and how to use subheadings and what to think about in terms of volume of information per page and that kind of stuff. And then there's standardizing boilerplate writing, like from Monzo as an example. We talked about APR a lot. We had to talk about interest rates a lot. And so why would we come up with a definition of what that is every time? So we standardize that, and then we have a library of repeatable bits of content that we can use to make sure that we're more efficient and we're more consistent in how we communicate. And we focused on trying to make those explanations really clear for things that typically finance makes more complicated. So the key thing in all those cases is to kind of get between the writer and the thing that they're writing so they don't have to go hunting. And the more bespoke it can feel like for that person or that team, the better. I would rather have 10 mini quick guides around the business that all, 70% of it says the same thing because it's the same core principles, but each guide feels personal to the relevant team. And so they use it rather than one giant guide that tries to do everything in one go and no one really feels like it's for them. And they never go because they have to fold through 45 pages to find what they need anyway.
Yeah, bless you for saying that, really. I completely agree. And I'm thinking that this is also one of the reasons why your process was so successful at such a large scale. Because I know that when we talked about Monzo, you said that they grew, I think, from 200 to 4,000 and something people. And so I'm assuming that the editorial structure, the writing structure, let's say, grew with it, scaled with the organization. Did it work?
I mean, when you grow that fast, nothing really works. Everything breaks every kind of 6 months. Like we went from, it was about 180 people when I joined. And in the first year, we hired something like 1,000 people. Now, most of them were doing customer service, frontline customer service. On the product business side, it was only went from 200 to like 500, but that's still more than doubling in a year. And the pace slowed down. That, yeah, what did we go, like 20 times the size in the time that I was there? It's ridiculous. And that pace did informally approach a little bit. And it was why I made it the goal of the team more than anything else to care about a culture of good writing rather than trying to be responsible directly for doing the writing themselves. Because how could you possibly scale quickly enough to handle that? We would just have ended up being a bottleneck that would have completely ground the business to a halt. So the writer in a business area like business banking was responsible for the overall quality of writing, not for doing all the writing or even necessarily checking all the writing that went out, because there was just too much, certainly towards the end of my time there. And then the other big piece of the puzzle as you grow is you need repetition of the big messages at the company level. You have to get up in company meetings and talk about this stuff. You have to have senior leaders who are bought in to echo your point of view. And you have to tie back how good writing is directly in service of what the company mission is and our values are. And that was easy at Monzo because we had one of our values was default to transparency. So transparency means that you have to explain things clearly, because if someone can't understand it, how can it be transparent? And we also had a company value that was help everyone belong. And how can you help people belong if they don't feel like they're included because they can understand what you're saying? So that helped with internal approaches to communication as well. And I, had a little leg up there because I helped write the values and the mission. So I managed to make sure that they were in line with that ultimate direction that the team was. But it was what the company believed in and what they still believe in now. If the company cares about being customer-centric, that is an easy way in to say, look, if you care about being customer-centric, then we have to care about all of the writing we do. And we have to adapt our processes and ways of thinking and ways of working to make sure that good writing happens across the business. Otherwise, how can we say we're customer-centric? And then you want to, shout about success stories and metrics that you've moved and prove that this stuff actually makes a difference. And we had tons of stories of times where, a writer had changed a few words and it had literally made or saved millions of pounds of revenue or radically changed metrics that we were interested in. So you could prove the value of writing as well as tying it back to those more abstract ideas of value and brand.
Are those metrics difficult to acquire? Was it difficult for you to gather the metrics that you needed to support your case or support, what you were doing? Because I think maybe a lot of people feel like they're not so easy to achieve, which I don't think is entirely true.
Yeah, it depends. Like Monzo, obviously it's a very technologically advanced business with really good data. And we were kind of obviously obsessed with checking if this thing worked and iterative product development, all that kind of stuff. So carving out space within an experiment or a product release or anything, or A/B testing an email or a subject line or whatever was pretty standard and easy for us. The thing you had to do was just get in there at the development stage and the strategy stage and say, hey, let's measure it. And that was why you needed, again, a writer embedded in a team so that they were there at the point that somebody was building the experiment, so they could brief the data analyst who was then going to come along later and review things. But every bit of writing has a purpose. And in a lot of cases, you can just measure the purpose. Like if an email gets a response rate, well, the email is writing. So the writer is responsible for that response rate as much as anyone else. I remember like an example from pre-Monzo days when I was a consultant working for a big bank that was not Monzo. And they had a letter that they'd been sending out for years, which was a key part of some big policy renewal process. And they swore blind that their 2% response rate was amazing and it just couldn't be improved on because this was a really dry topic. And I looked at that letter and I did a quick rewrite on it. It took about half an hour, made the main point clearer, highlighted the deadline, simplified the language, and the response rate went up 427%. And they had to get in extra people over lunchtime to open all the envelopes from customers because they were so unprepared for how effective it was going to be. What other thing can a business change in half an hour for free, essentially, to have that big an impact on company metrics? This is that point around the underestimated impact of writing. And so if you have the lens of what we're delivering here is words, not an email, what we're delivering here is words, not an ad, what we're delivering here is words, not an app journey, then you just measure the words in it and the difference that they make. And yeah, you can get tons of evidence of the difference it makes. And it's much cheaper and easier than shipping a new product or replatforming something or other kind of more expensive tech-based solutions that companies usually think they need to do if they want to really move metric.
I love that. The combination of that plus what you were saying earlier about how if you want it to scale, then you need to educate people and equip them with the right mentality and the right approach and the right guidelines or guidance at the point of use in order to make them more successful really aligns with a lot of the stuff that I believe in as well. You know, that I'm not here to do it for you. I'm here, even as an editor with Branding Mag, for example, I always try to give the contributors and tell the other editors, don't change it for them. You need to explain to them what it is and see how they progress through the process. And I suppose that's where the worry is a little bit with AI, which we haven't really touched on that much. But is it really necessary for us to use it? Is it really as necessary of a requirement like every, trend report out there is telling us? What has your experience been with AI in the context of writing?
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of tools that can make a bit of writing easier to read. ChatGPT is good at that. Hemingway app is a free kind of online one that's been around for years that's good at that. Textio, Grammarly, they're all good at that. But honestly, like Microsoft Word's spelling and grammar check has been able to do a decent job of that for decades. It's not a new thing. But the important thing is that making words simpler is not necessarily making the writing more effective. A good piece of writing addresses the needs of the reader, the context and the medium in which they'll be reading it, the wider context of the journey in which this piece of writing sits, what else the reader will have seen from the business, the broader macro environment around this topic or the industry, and a bunch of other stuff. And so a writer should always be balancing that stuff in their head. And right now, I don't see any AI tools that can even do a few of those things at the same time. Like an AI writing tool is not going to say, hang on a minute, like, does the reader care about this topic? Like this paragraph here, why is that here? And it's not going to say, hang on a minute, you've written this email, but what about this other thing that's related to the problem that happened last month that really we should touch on because otherwise they're going to find it weird that we've not included it. Like it's not actually addressing the content and the tone and the structure of what the reader cares about. It's just editing words, which is not a new tool. So they're not nearly as fancy as they claim to be, I don't think. And will they be able to get there? I think probably. But to get an AI agent that is capable of balancing all those things, you have to plug it into all of those varied sources of information to get a holistic picture to do writing that considers all those variables. And most companies just are not joined up enough internally to give an AI tool that context. They have legacy systems that don't talk to each other. They have a poorly maintained knowledge base. They have different platforms for storing different kinds of communications and all these other problems. So there is a big org structure barrier that I don't see going away anytime soon because most companies adopting AI are using it as an excuse not to do the hard work of actually making their org structure better. So the problem is not really how sophisticated an AI tool is. The problem is how unsophisticated most companies are once you scratch below the surface. And so, can ChatGPT do a decent job of editing an email to make the writing clearer? Absolutely. But Was it the right email to be sending in the first place? Should it have even been an email? How does the email tie back to the marketing messaging or the operational processes? Those are the actual questions of what makes writing effective. And that's why you need a person. And maybe AI tools will get there one day, but companies, I think, are really, they're just trying to do more mediocre stuff faster. And that is what AI tools are mostly enabling at the moment.
So when you're thinking about building your team, you don't really consider that to be, let's say, one of the skills required for being a part of what you're building, or because now I'm curious what the skills are that, you actually look for in your people.
Yeah, I think it is foolish to pretend that the standard of the technology now is the standard of the technology, because it's come on light years, obviously, even in the last 2 or 3 years, and it will continue to develop. But like I said, that the ability of whatever version of ChatGPT is not the issue. The issue is the ability of the company to actually integrate it in a meaningful way. So using ChatGPT to ask niche questions that Google would otherwise struggle to answer, like, that's useful. And if you can prompt it the right way to challenge your thinking, that is maybe a useful thing to do. But I also question how effective those things are, because I've seen, stories about versions of ChatGPT that were just agreed with whatever you said and had to get rolled back because they're obviously trying to balance usability with effectiveness. And ultimately, all it is still is the world's best next word generator. That is all it is. It's just very, very good at it. So for me, a good writer is someone who is always able to explain what they've done and why, how what they're doing makes sense in the wider picture of what the company is doing, what that team is doing. And so you need to be able to think in terms of the purpose and the impact of your writing and how to measure that stuff. Lots of people can turn a nice phrase, and that is something definitely that, an AI tool can help you with. But in interviews, I'll always ask candidates, how do you know your writing is good? And that often leaves people flapping around because they've never really imagined or interrogated, why do I do what I do? It just kind of comes naturally. And so to do this role of trying to change the culture and have an approach that begets go in the room or not, you have to be able to do good writing, but you also have to help other people do good writing. Like you spoke earlier about not doing everything for people. Like our mantra when we were reviewing writing from other people was help, not fix. Like you would point out objectively which principles they were following, which they weren't, and why, and help them see how to do that better themselves. And that is raising the bar all the time. And to do that, you have to be able to help people understand what great writing even is and how it changes by context and the science and the theory behind it and how it ties into their goals. And you have to be able to think about the big picture of what the brand is trying to do and what the systems are and the whole product map that you're working with, as well as getting down and dirty over where a semicolon should go in a sentence. Because when you're trying to build a culture, you can't always be in the weeds, but equally you have to be able to get in the weeds and unpick exactly what doesn't work in a sentence if you're ever going to get the credibility you need to be given permission to try and build that culture in the first place.
I think given how comprehensive and, let's say, nuanced what you just described is, I feel very confident in saying that, you agree that we most certainly cannot be replaced by any type of technology. I love the approach, really. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain it, to go through the process, to see, I really am rooting for you to become the first chief writing officer. If there isn't one yet, we're going to have to look that up and see. But if you ever need anybody to vie for why you're the right man for the job, then you definitely have another person in your corner now, because I appreciate the thinking. I appreciate the approach, and I appreciate people like yourself that are not fighting the good fight. That's not the point, but just looking beyond the immediate and the obvious to really see what truly makes a difference for people and for organizations and for the people they serve, and just for the level of impact that an organization has nowadays. So I very much appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That's really kind. I mean, I would say that it's much easier to talk about than it is to do it. Maybe I'll come back and talk another time about all the ways it went wrong and all the mistakes I made, because I think those are also interesting and useful. But I do feel like it's the right approach. But equally, I'm always on the lookout for, something better. What's the first principles way to approach this? And hopefully someone can show me a better way and I can take it easy.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of this kind of mentality, is that you do accept that it's ever evolving. You do accept that you don't know everything. You do accept there is a level of of long-term thinking also in that sense, that it's not just about what I know right now, but I have to build into the systems and into the processes the ability of it to be flexible, even though there are ways of doing things, but it must also live in harmony with the people that are living in harmony with it. I think that's the human approach that is way more human to me than any kind of like raw verbal language, these kinds of, specifics that people kind of look for to present authenticity. I say, no, the process needs to reflect people and their behaviors and live and breathe with them.
Yeah.
That's when you've done something that really is.
It's funny and quite revealing that the first thing a writer will sit down to do when you're giving them a brief about like a letter to a customer is to say, tell me about this customer. What do they care about? What are they interested in? What have they been up to? Get the context. And then when writers are trying to explain to people in a business why their work is important, they go, writing is important and my job is important and I'm important and I should be involved in this work. Hello? What about the audience? Have you considered what they might be interested in, how you might help them? I think writers in general do have a bit of responsibility to bear for not being able to make the case as effectively as they should for why this stuff is important. And all the evidence is out there. The science is out there. The research is out there. The metrics moved by writing is out there. It's not a secret. So I would hope that more people kind of pick it up and run with it.
Wonderful. I think that's a lovely place to end. So thank you again very much, Harry, for joining me. And yeah, for all of those listening, I'll see you on the next episode of Think Editorial. Thanks so much.